Our next speakers this afternoon are Dr. Gry Hoffman-Barford and Dr. Ian Freestone. Dr. Barford is a geochemist at Aarhus University in Denmark. She applies chemistry to solve problems in archaeology and to trace the origin of glass, pottery, and pigments. And Dr. Freestone is professor of archaeological materials and technology at University College London. He is a recipient of the Archaeological Institute of America's Pomeranz Medal for scientific contributions to archaeology and a member of the editorial boards of the Journal of Archaeological Science, Archaeometry, Journal of Cultural Heritage, and Journal of Glass Studies. They will be sharing some of the results from the new scientific study of the glass found at Jalame in their paper titled Chemical Analysis of the Jalame Assemblage, a lens into Roman glassmaking. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Julie. Yes, we'll be talking about the chemical analysis of a selection of Jalame glasses. And I hope, or we hope, that they will answer all questions as indicated by Catherine earlier in an earlier talk, but we'll do our best. First, I would like to present the team. So here we are. It includes Yael, who gave the keynote talk earlier, and Catherine Larson, who is organizing this seminar, as well as Chen Shan, who is Ian's PhD student from UCL in London. And the selection of glass that we've been working on comes from Robert Brill's selection that he brought back. He was part of the original excavations and brought back to Corning Museum. And here are the boxes. And Catherine had a better picture of all of these boxes. I know because we both went through them trying to find a mineral called pyrolusite, which they used at this site. And we succeeded in doing this, but I'll let Ian talk more about that later. Brill published his discoveries from the chemistry in 1988, and that was kind of a really, really extensive study, both of the glass, but also of part of the ceramics and the raw materials. And that gave us a very good base to work from. Our first question in this study was, does Brill's analysis still hold? And could the Jalame really be the site of extensive Roman production? And the difference would be that these analysis doesn't compare well to present-day analysis by the electron microprobe, which is what most people use for major elements. His analysis was done by atomic absorption. Here to the right is a plot of elements that's controlled by the glass-making sands. It's titanium, aluminum, and silica. And the round blue circle is the composition of the Roman glasses. And our question was, if when we redo some of his samples and other samples, do they then plot within this blue circle, or do they plot to the right, which is where Brill's analysis plotted? And our data is in red, yellow, and blue, and it plots exactly on top of Brill's. So no, it doesn't match the earlier Roman production, but it matches exactly Brill's composition. There's a little bit of difference, but overall, his data set is very, very excellent. So that was the answer to the first questions. So the second goal we had was to better try to understand the production processes at Jalame. We have already seen that there's a whole range of colors. You see them to the right here. And we wanted to select the whole range. To the left, you see two pieces. One is yellow, it has no manganese, and one is purple. So what they did is they added manganese to oxidize the iron and make the glass transparent, just like the Romans did. And we wanted to kind of select a whole range of manganese and also the whole range of colors. Here, the one to the left, the purple one, there has been so much manganese added that it's not only oxidizing the iron, it's actually becoming a colorant and turning the glass purple. So those are the two extremes. And here you see examples of the whole range from in the bottom right corner, no manganese, and in the top left corner, you see the purple glass, which has a lot of manganese, 4.6 weight%. There's a plot here by Catherine showing the distribution of colors, showing that most of them are greenish blue and yellowish green, just as Yale also mentioned. And then there are the really rare ones, and we included kind of the whole range. We also wanted to make sure that we selected the whole range of manganese. So we did a screening where we screened a lot of glass and then made sure that we got the whole range from no manganese to a lot of manganese, because it's not always that the color is reflecting how much manganese is in there after they've been in the soil for so many years. We couldn't analyze everything, so we focused on the moils because they represent the vessels that were made and presumably exported from Jalame. We also focused on the chunks, which represents the raw glass made there. And in total, we analyzed 42 glass samples precisely. So after the screening, we analyzed 42, plus a number of bricks or ceramics that presumably came from the furnaces. Our third goal was to obtain a baseline so that when Jalame-like glasses are found around the world, you can link them back by analyzing them. And here we could do a lot more than Brill because of the lower detection limits we have nowadays in the different methods. So we were able to do a lot of elements that he wasn't able to do. And we used a method called for that, laser ablation ICP-MS, which is a method where you have a laser shoot down on the glass, and it actually drills into the glass and picks up the material in an aerosol and transport it into a mass spectrometer. And on its way in, it hits this torch, which is as hot as the surface of the sun. And here the atoms are really torn apart and then sent into the detector, and then you can measure each element depending on what mass and what charge they have. So we managed to measure 60 elements using the electron microprobe and the laser ablation ICP-MS, and that revealed a lot of fun little stories. And one of them was hidden in molybdenum and barium, actually showing that there are two types of manganese ores being used at Jalame, and they had different molybdenum and barium, and that was what we were searching for in the boxes. Could we find some of this original mineral ore material in the boxes? We also measured the composition of a single element, and that element is hafnium. And we did that using a multi-collector ICP-MS. As you can hear, I'm a chemist, so this is a little nerdy, but I found this picture of the multi-collector many years ago, and I love it because you send in the sample and magic happens because it hits the temperature of the surface of the sun, and then they go flying into the flight tube, and the heavier one will have a different path than the lighter isotope. And it's really not a big mass difference. There's hafnium, which is a light one, 176, has 176 particles in the core, whereas the other one has 180 particles in the core. So the mass difference is very tiny. But because there's a difference, this humongous magnet will send them on different paths, and they'll hit the detector, each their detector, and you can precisely measure the ratio. So why did we want to measure hafnium isotopes? That's because previously we have shown that that this can actually pinpoint whether a glass is produced along the coast of the Levantine or in Egypt. And this is a surprise because actually the sands are the same. The sands are coming from the Nile, coming out in the Mediterranean. They get caught up in this current that takes them up along the coast of Israel. So in principle, the composition could have been the same. But what is really happening is that the host of hafnium, which is a mineral called zircon, is systematically falling out because it's heavy or it's chunky, we don't know, but it's systematically falling out. So there's a different composition in glass that's made up along the coast of Israel and glass that is made in Egypt. Basically, in Egypt, it has a more negative value, and I don't have to talk about what that means, but it basically means that the rocks that the zircons were coming from are older in the sands in Egypt than they are in the sands up along the Levantine coast. And sure enough, Jalame is plotting in the Levant range of hafnium isotopes. So this was very good because that means that this actually holds, or nature is very systematic, and we can use it to provenance things like glass. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Ian. Say thank you.
Thank you, Gree. It's very nice start. So I'm just going to try and control slides if I can. I can't at the moment move them. Could someone, got it. Okay. So our first question was, are the earlier finds at Jalame related to the 2015, the new furnaces excavated in the region, in the immediate area? Were they making raw glass at Jalame, as has been suggested now by Yael for the Red Room? We also wanted to know the extent to which they imported glass from elsewhere. Can I have the next one, please, Dan? Thank you. Well, the first thing, some of the samples went to one of our students at UCL, Chen, and she found that some of the glass was underfired in the chunks. And here you can see, indicated by the white arrows, sand grains sitting in a matrix of glass. And these correspond more or less in size to the sand grains we find on the beach at the mouth of the River Belus, the place mentioned by Pliny. And so we can be fairly confident that they are making raw glass on the site. I think that's quite likely. Next one, please. Now, the reason they're making sand on the at Jalame and on the Levantine coast is for two reasons. The first one is it's a very good sand. It's low in iron, which tends to make a relatively light colored glass. And the sands there have got just the right amount of silica and lime in the form of shells to make a good composition. But also along the coast, it's fairly easy to transport natron from the lakes in Egypt. And on the left-hand side of the slide, you can see a lake called Barnouji in the Egyptian delta, where it's drying out in the spring and the natron is crystallizing around the surface, around the edge of the lake. And natron is a form of sodium carbonate. And by the time the lake dries, or most of the lake dries in the autumn, you can take big slabs of this material out and you can use that to make glass. And that's what the Romans were doing. The process started in the middle of the first millennium BCE and continued until around the 9th century of the current era. Next, please. Now, as Gree showed, when you compare the analysis of glass from Jalame with the analysis of Roman glass from Europe, which has been quite heavily analysed now, especially in Italy, France, and Britain, there's a slight difference. The Jalame glass, shown in the browns and yellow symbols in this graph, is richer in aluminium, in aluminium oxide, than the glass from Europe. Now, it doesn't correspond to 1st to 3rd century Roman glass. But we do find around the 4th century, perhaps towards the end of the 4th century, actually, we do find Jalame glass occurring in Europe at that time. So there's a slight mismatch with the main period of Roman glass production, when they were really exporting massive amounts. But if we go to the next slide, please. This may be one of the things we wanted to test was, is this an artifact? Is it really just because the glass you collect from Jalame is often been fairly recently in the furnaces? It's probably coming from the edges of the furnace. A lot of it is waste glass. So could it be due to a reaction with the furnace? Now, in most of the Roman world, we're used to furnaces and pots to hold glass being made of clay. But actually, as Yale has pointed out, at Jalame, the furnace sits directly on the rock floor of the area, which is limestone, rich in lime, which doesn't contain much aluminium. So if we go to the next slide, please. This is here's on the left-hand side, you can see one of the limestone floors in the 2015 furnace. And on the right-hand side, we've got a cross-section between furnace wall and glass from the earlier excavation at Jalame, from the Corning Museum collections. And what you can see is that actually there's a calcium-rich layer along the boundary between the glass and the furnace, which protects it from contamination by the aluminium and also by iron oxides. It protects the glass. And so the analysis we're getting of this bluish glass from Jalame is likely to be the real thing. It's not contaminated, and this is actually what the glass they were exporting would have been like. So our analyses and Grie's isotope and trace element analysis reflect the glass that Jalame would have exported. So next slide, please. Where is the Roman glass, the earlier Roman glass, coming from? The isotopes, as we've seen, not only for Jalame but for elsewhere, show that most Roman glass, or a lot of blue-green Roman glass from the 1st to 3rd centuries, is of Levantine origin. But all the primary glass furnaces we've analysed so far have been south in Israel, have been south of Haifa. And they all have aluminium, which is higher than Roman glass in Europe. Roman glass in Europe is about 2.3, 2.4, 2.5%, whereas Levantine glass, that so far analysed from the primary furnaces, is around 3%. And what we suspect is that we're probably looking at furnaces to the north, possibly around Akko, where Yale has already pointed out there is evidence for primary glass production, but even possibly as further north as Sidon or Beirut. And recently there have been some reports of glass furnaces in Beirut by Julian Henderson and his colleagues. Next slide, please. So the next thing we turned to was the making of colourless and purple glass, because there is colourless and purple glass at Jalame, not a great deal of it, but it's there. As we've seen, the majority of the glass is blue. And we know that colourless or transparent glass was highly valued. And this seems to have been produced by adding something called a decolorizer to the blue glass. So the glass is blue because of the presence of iron. The iron's in what we call the reduced state, divalent Fe2 plus ions. If you add a decolorizer, it oxidizes the iron and the glass appears colorless. Now, in Egypt, they used antimony to do this, the element antimony. It's quite a rare one. It's another story altogether. It is interesting. But at Jalame, they added manganese dioxide. And this was the component at concentrations of around 1% or so, which caused the glass to be colourless. So let's go to the next slide, please. So what does manganese ore look like in the flesh, so to speak? So these pictures on the left are from Fainan, and the dark area you see there is rich in manganese. And in the center photograph, there's a vein, what's effectively a vein or a layer of manganese about half a meter across, a couple of feet across, which is of manganese dioxide. And this would have been the sort of material that was used at Jalame to decolor the glass and also to make it purple. And on the right-hand side is a shot, one of Grie's shots, where she's taken one of these tiny pieces of manganese ore. She found it with Kate in the Corning archive, and she's analysed that. You can see her crosshair where she shoots it on the slide to prove it's manganese ore, and this is the decolorant and the colorizer they're using. And you can see that piece is very small, only about half a centimetre across. Next slide, please. So this picture shows the effect of manganese on the colour of the glass. You can see the colours represented on the left-hand side by the arrows. Up to about 0.5 or 1% of manganese oxide, the colour appears bluish. Between 0.7 and 1.7%, the area of the white triangles, which are colourless samples we analysed, you can see that the glass is colourless. And then as you put more manganese into the glass, it turns purple. And this is how they did it. Next slide. But the question then arises, why is there so much glass with small amounts of manganese, up to about 0.5%, which make very little difference indeed to the colour? Next slide. And those colours are variable. They're bluish, they can be yellow and green. And the manganese seems to be there almost by accident. Next. And we think they had a mixing difficulty with manganese. At the top, you can see a fragment of the glass. On one side, it's got 2.1% manganese in. At the bottom, it's got 1.7. And it's very difficult to mix 1% of a material with 99% of another. And looking at the Bet Sharim slab, which Yale has already mentioned, and which Robert Brill analysed back in the 60s and 70s, the manganese is not homogeneously distributed in this slab. It's the only slab we have. And so we're suggesting that they added manganese to the raw glass. It wasn't homogeneously distributed, and there were patches of colourless and patches of purple glass. And when they broke these slabs up, they separated out the chunks of colourless and purple. And there's not a lot of it on the side, so this might explain why. Next slide, please. So one of the things that comes out of this is the competition with Egypt. Grie has shown how her isotopic analyses allow us to separate Egyptian and Levantine products. Egypt made an expensive but better quality glass, 24 denarii a pound, whereas the Levant made a weakly coloured, a greenish glass, typically used for windows and containers, which was cheaper. Now, this competition seems to have started from at least the 1st century. Next, please. Through to the time of Jalame, but late in the 4th century, something changes. In Europe, after Jalame, glass becomes dominated by Egyptian products rather than Levantine products. And it seems that the demise of Jalame corresponds with a depression in the export of Levantine glass, which perhaps doesn't cover for perhaps a century until the time of Apollonia, which production at Apollonia, which Ruth Jackson Tal will talk about later. And so that's where we are. Can I have the next slide, please? And I'd just like to thank the Corning Museum of Glass, the Daniel P. and Wilmot B. Van Kamen Fund. They funded the analyses in memory of Marlene Van Kamen, and also the people who helped with the analysis in the lab. And finally, the co-authors of this. It was a genuine team effort, and we all found it very exciting to be working on this earlier material, this legacy material from Gladys Weinberg and Robert Brill. And I can't agree more with the previous speaker who said we should keep going back and looking at this stuff as things, as techniques improve. Thank you.
Thank you so much to you both. This was fantastic. I love hearing about the role of manganese in these different concentrations in the final glass products. Everyone who's attending, please post your questions in the Q&A or in the chat. In the meantime, I have a question for Gry. I was wondering, because you mentioned that your isotopic analysis detected 2 different ores for manganese. The first one, I assume, is the one from Fainan in Jordan. Do you know the source of the other, or am I getting this wrong?
So it wasn't isotopes, it was molybdenum and barium.
Okay.
That showed the difference between the two, and we don't know yet where the 2 sources are. So this would be a next step, is to start looking, now that we have the raw material, is to try to provenance them back to the ores. That would be really interesting.
Yeah, I can't emphasize enough that actually I showed Fainan as an example of what manganese looks like in the region. We don't know the manganese came from Fainan.
But
there's a lot of manganese in the
an
Eastern
obvious
Desert.
place. Yeah.
Yeah.
I see. Thank you. We have a question again about this purple, thinking about how the Byzantines prized royal purple in other materials, I assume. Was the high manganese glass more valued, in your opinion?
Good question. Coloured glass was always, I think, more valued, as well as purely colourless glass. You've got to remember, most glass, the window glass, the transport vessels, the bulk of the glass was bluey green, even a pale bluey green. But whether manganese-rich glass was preferred to colourless, pure colourless glass, I don't think we can be sure. It might be something that Kate Larson can comment on, because she's seen a lot more of these vessels in context than I have, or Gry has, I think.
Thank you. Oh yeah, the questions are coming in. So how big a sherd can you analyze? If working with vessels or large sherds or reconstructible shapes, it would be valuable to say that it's Levantine or Egyptian, or what? Small big bits or chunks rarely fit into a vessel typology. What do you think?
Gry?
Do you need the person to clarify the question?
No.
Okay.
So, well, 10 centimeters is about as big as you can get in the chamber of a laser ablation system, and that's going some. Most glass we analyze is broken from shards as small fragments. Occasionally, a really fabulous vessel has been broken in the past, such as the Portland vase, which enabled us to analyze that. We wouldn't take a risk of taking a piece off it these days. But at the moment, you can't get really high, precise and accurate analyses from complete vessels. It would be wonderful if we could. Has to be fairly large sherds. If there's a pointy corner, we break a couple of millimeters off.
Thank you. Another question. Was the only opportunity to add manganese dioxide with the primary melt? Is it not effective when added to the remelt for secondary production? How does that work?
My answer, yeah, okay. Yeah, you can. You can do it at the secondary. They certainly did it in secondary production in Venice. Okay. In Venice, they were adding manganese, and you can see it's been shown by Marco Verretta, one of the specialists there, that they were adding it at the secondary production. At the moment, what we find is that where they're using decolorized glass, for example, at Bet Sharim, at Jalame, in blocks found in the sea off the coast of Israel, in the furnaces in Egypt, the manganese and the antimony are added at the primary stage or in the primary furnaces. Now, it may be they have a secondary stage in the primary sites where they then take a fraction of the glass and add the manganese or add the antimony. We couldn't disprove that. But certainly, it looks at the moment as if in the Roman world, in the first millennium CE, really, they were adding manganese in association with primary production rather than secondary production.
Bree, I don't want to leave you out of this conversation. Please feel free to jump in. Another question, the mineral content of the glass also affects its melting point and how easy it is to work when blowing. Was that a consideration, and might it explain why manganese was added to glass at levels that did not change the color?
Well, yeah, the problem is that the amount is only 0.5%. Okay, it would probably make 5 or 10 degrees difference to the melting temperature and have a minimal effect on the viscosity, on the working properties of the glass. So yeah, additions do affect glass properties, but at this level, I think it's quite unlikely.
Thank you. Another question, is it known why the Jalame glass industry lost the competition to Egypt in the late 4th century?
If only we knew. Yeah, it's really difficult to say. Well, what happens is, okay, Egypt was making glass using antimony as a decolorizer. It made this very expensive colourless glass, which was used in relatively high status vessels. Really, the vessels aren't as abundant. Then there's not as many of them. There's not as much glass as the cheaper Levantine glass, which is blue-green. But in the 4th century, around 350 or within 20 or so years of that, Rome appears to have lost what is now Romania and the source of the antimony. So all of a sudden, the Egyptians could no longer decolor and make this very expensive colourless glass. And they seem to have swapped to go over to kind of mass production of this really greenish, yellowish glass, which we call HIMT because it's got high iron in it. And that, why that took off is a bit uncertain, but the Egyptians had the advantage in that they were right next to the natron deposits. Egyptian glass always has 3% more soda than Levantine glass of the same period. So they were making a much more workable glass as well. So it's possible it was just an easier glass for glass workers to work. But it's speculation.
Thank you. We also had a question in the chat at the very beginning of your presentation. So it might be an open question. how far wide was collaboration or technological transfer across Roman societies, i.e., were the same skills used in other Roman sites in the European or UK areas?
Okay. The only place they were making prime glass from raw materials, from sand and natron, seems to have been the Levant and Egypt, the Eastern Mediterranean, where the raw materials occur. So that skill doesn't seem to have transferred. But what did transfer remarkably quickly is, of course, glass blowing. Well, the first traces of glass blowing crop up in the 1st century BCE, maybe about 50 BC. And by the middle of the 1st century CE, they've spread all over the Roman Empire. So there is a lot of technical transfer going on, but in order to use a technology, you need the raw materials.